This podcast episode contains mature language and may not be suitable for all audiences.
Ravi Ragbir has been a vocal immigration reform activist since 2006, when he started fighting his own deportation order. But more than 10 years later, in 2018, when he was sitting in the ICE office in Lower Manhattan, it looked like maybe that fight was over.
The assistant director came in and he said, this is it. You're going, right? As he said those words, my heart started to race, beat 3 times more faster. And I felt that I was going to faint.
And he did, briefly. But that was enough reason for ICE agents to call an ambulance.
This is what they said they called the ambulance. But it wasn't just an ambulance. They realized they could use it as a way to spirit me out.
At that moment, outside the building, NYPD officers were violently confronting protesters who showed up by the hundreds to support Ravi. He went into the ICE offices knowing he might not come out. So he brought a lot of friends.
Back up. It was surreal. I would say, if you ask me what I felt, I don't know what I felt. I had an out of body experience, like just watching this, because if I had allowed myself to get wrapped up in my emotions, I don't know what I would have done, what I felt, what I would have, I had to keep myself from breaking down.
After he recovered, Ravi was handcuffed and loaded up into an ambulance. But when the ambulance tried to leave, protesters, including a handful of New York City council members, tried to stop it.
As the ambulance drove down Broadway, City Council members Udonis Rodriguez and Jumani Williams sat down to block its way.
Eventually, the ambulance made it to the hospital. That was when an agent turned to Ravi's wife, Amy.
And they told her get out, and as soon as she came out, they closed the door and they sped away, right? They sped away because they didn't want her with me.
By that night, Ravi was incarcerated, 1,200 miles away, in a Miami immigration detention center. So why did ICE go through all this trouble just to get rid of one man? Ravi was clearly not a threat to national security. What he was a squeaky wheel, a really, really squeaky wheel.
How the people would describe me, especially Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is I'm a pain in the ass. I talk a lot, but when I speak, it's about highlighting the issues around the injustice and the darkness that represents the immigration framework that is the United States, right?
Ravi is passionate and outspoken, and he hasn't been shy about calling out ICE. In fact, there's a chance you've heard of him. The story of his activism and subsequent detention made international news because it seemed to be an obvious retaliation for his criticism of US immigration policies. You might be asking yourself, how can the government do this? This is Speech and the Border, at the frontiers of censorship and surveillance. My name is George Wang, and I'm a lawyer at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. As an immigrant, a former green card holder, and now a US citizen, understanding how the law shapes the people and ideas that move across borders isn't just a professional interest. It's personal. The border has long been a gray area for free expression. For much of its history, the United States government has used the border as a pretext for surveillance and censorship. In the digital age, new technologies have reshaped what the border means, which has only reinforced the government's power to control the flow of information. In this series, we will explore the often precarious state of free expression at and across borders. Make no mistake, even natural-born US citizens are not immune to the kinds of threats we'll discuss over the next few weeks. Anyone coming into the US could be subject to a suspicionless search of their laptop or phone, and anyone, anywhere, could be a victim of the long arm of repressive governments around the world, thanks to a thriving international market for spyware. The Knight First Amendment Institute is dedicated to defending the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age. Over the next few episodes, you'll hear from different Knight Institute lawyers like me, along with some of the people we've worked with. People like Ravi Ragbir.
I came here because I wanted to. I came here because I wanted to have the flexibility, going to school, working, etc., etc.
Ravi came to the U.S. from Trinidad and Tobago more than 30 years ago.
I used to be on 8th floor cleaning windows. I used to be working in a liquor store. I used to be working in an insurance company.
One of the places he worked was Household Finance Corporation. Ravi was living here as a permanent resident and working for Household as a salesman. That is, until the company was being sued for fraud, and Ravi was caught up in the proceedings.
They accused me of approving loans and approving the loans so that co-conspirator who they charged me with would benefit from that. I did not benefit from those loans. I just benefited from the work I did as the account executive or the salesperson.
He was convicted of wire fraud and sentenced to prison. The conviction, as many convictions do, meant that he was subject to possible deportation. After serving a couple years in prison, he was transferred to immigration detention in Alabama. To Ravi, there is prison, and then there was this.
When you're in prison, you say you do your time, don't let the time do you, right? And the way you do time is you count down the days. You can grasp at that, but in immigration, there is no countdown. There is no end to that time in prison. And because of that, you are never calm.
The threat of violence was also ever present. Ravi remembers an incident where officers fired into his cell with pepper grenades, which made it impossible to breathe.
And then they came in and they handcuffed us and dragged us by the scruff of our neck and smashed our face in the rec yard, which is concrete.
Attorneys visited the detention center Ravi was held at, and he told them about what happened. Eventually, they were able to help him get released in 2008. But that didn't mean that Ravi was free.
I had an ankle monitor for about 8 months, so I had to go to ICE every 3 times a week to check in, to report. And then they are supposed to come to my home every other week unannounced. So can you guess how I actually lived? I do not remember for those months how I survived. What I did, I mean, I'm here and I've survived it, but thinking about how I would go in on those 3 days, every day thinking whether this is it. But it's not just about that. Financially, how was I able to take care of myself? And I have no memory because it's just a black space there.
All of this, his conviction, his detention, living under the close watch of immigration authorities, galvanized Ravi into a ferocious advocate for immigration reform. Ravi eventually became a full-time organizer for an immigration advocacy organization, the New Sanctuary Coalition, based in New York City.
The New Sanctuary Coalition is faith-based. It used to be made up of houses of worship and people of faith, so the congregation, the faith leaders, and the house of worship and the denominations. We opened that up so anybody with faith were a member.
People of faith supporting and protecting immigrants in their community.
When I do presentations, I speak about people facing immigration, deportation, or immigrants on the whole. I don't refer to them as immigrants or migrants. I refer to them as friends. Right? The word immigrant, the word migrant is so toxic that once you throw it out, you first have to deal with that toxicity before you can talk about anything else. So let's move away from that. They are all friends, and therefore let's talk about how we can help our friends and how we can be there to support them.
Ravi would eventually become the executive director of the New Sanctuary Coalition. He knew firsthand how isolated the immigration system can make someone feel. During his regular check-ins with ICE, he drew on the support of family and friends, some of whom would join him at these appointments. Having someone there made a huge difference. Ravi started to realize this could also be a powerful form of activism.
Now, everyone does accompaniment, right? You just go with somebody and you're there.
Okay, when he puts it like that, it sounds simple. But Ravi was teaching volunteers to do more than just show up and physically be there. Accompaniment was also a powerful form of resistance.
Because the imagery of ICE is about intimidation, it's about strength, it's about I can destroy you. And they're a civil agency. So one of the first things we had to teach people is, as a citizen, ICE has no power over you. So you can stand up to ICE. Obviously, you can't stop them taking Ravi away, but ICE has no authority from you. Which changed the way people looked at the way they interacted. Our training about the accompaniment is about every step, what you would do if an officer does this to you. What would you do if this happens?
So not only was Ravi advocating for change, but he was training others on how to protect their neighbors, their friends. And through these actions, he was challenging ICE's authority and its culture of fear. It's starting to make sense why Ravi's work might bother ICE. But of course, that's kind of the point. It's activism, it's resistance, and it's constitutionally protected. After Ravi disappeared in an ambulance on the morning of January 10th, 2018, his lawyers raced to keep him in the country, and succeeded. Ravi then sued the government, accusing ICE of violating his First Amendment rights by targeting him for deportation because of his activism. If ICE were permitted to deport Ravi in retaliation for his advocacy, it would have grave consequences for free speech. Left unchecked, ICE could easily abuse that power to go after individuals facing removal orders simply because they express views the government doesn't like. What happened to Ravi might sound extraordinary, but unfortunately it's not. It's in line with a practice that has a long history in this country, one called ideological exclusion.
Ideological exclusion is the barring of foreign non-citizens based on their political beliefs, expressions, and associations.
Julia Rose Kraut is a lawyer, historian, and author of the book Thread of Dissent, a history of ideological exclusion and deportation in the United States.
Some people just think it's an immigration issue. Some people just think it's a free speech First Amendment issue. It's both.
The First Amendment safeguards one of our most important and precious liberties, the freedom of speech. And that freedom includes the right to criticize the government. So when the government tries to kick out its critics or bar them from entering the country, well, that's a betrayal of the promises of the First Amendment and of our democracy. But Julia says that the fear that Americans may somehow be subverted by a dangerous foreign element is a fear almost as old as America itself. And our country's long, long history of ideological exclusion is still haunting us today. It's 1901, and President William McKinley was just assassinated by a man named Leon Czolgosz.
And Czolgosz was born in the United States, but as the press reported, had a, quote, foreign-sounding name. And this is the event that really marks the United States' entry into what would be referred to as the War on Anarchy.
By the time McKinley was shot, European leaders had already been working to suppress anarchist newspapers and to deport anarchists, branding them a threat. The Knight Institute's home state of New York outlawed the advocacy, teaching, or publication of anarchist ideas, and the federal government wanted to follow suit. So in 1903, Congress passed the Alien Immigration Act.
So this is a law that excludes anarchists from the United States, defined as a person who disbelieves in or is opposed to all organized government, or who is a member of or affiliated with an organization entertaining and teaching such belief. And notice, there is no distinction between a violent or a philosophical anarchist in this law. How are you going to determine who's an anarchist? Couldn't they just lie? In terms of if someone's asking, do you believe in anarchy?
Of course, not all anarchists were trying to assassinate world leaders, but the law didn't draw a line. Instead, it outlawed engaging with the very idea of anarchy itself. Or at least it tried. After the McKinley assassination, any anarchist was considered dangerous. The same year the Alien Immigration Act was passed, a man named John Turner was arrested in New York City. Turner was an English trades unionist and anarchist who had been invited to the US to give a lecture. But once he arrived, he was almost immediately ordered deported for his anarchist beliefs. Turner decided to work with a newly formed organization called the Free Speech League to challenge the constitutionality of the Alien Immigration Act.
He's challenging the constitutionality of the Alien Immigration Act on the unchecked absolute power of public officials to exclude and the First Amendment violation of freedom of expression and belief, and then argues that the act had turned public officials enforcing it into censors.
Turner, for the record, wasn't confident in his case. While out on bail, before the Supreme Court made a decision, he had already packed up and returned to England. He figured he would lose.
And he was right. So Chief Justice Melville Fuller, in a unanimous decision, upholds the constitutionality of the Alien Immigration Act. He writes that Congress has the power and the right to exclude anyone it wishes, including anarchists.
The Turner case established a very troubling precedent. It meant that not only could the government exclude whoever it wanted to, but it could basically do so with impunity, making it nearly impossible for non-citizens living in the US to bring a challenge. It didn't matter that Turner was not himself violent and had only been invited to give a talk. All that mattered was he had the wrong ideas, dangerous ideas, at least according to the government. The court applied what's called the plenary power doctrine.
The immigration legal doctrine, the plenary power doctrine, is established by a series of Supreme Court decisions in the late 19th century, including Che Chang-ping versus United States, 1889, which upheld Chinese exclusion. And in these cases, the Supreme Court declared that as a sovereign nation, the United States had an inherent right to self-preservation and had a plenary power to restrict immigration to protect itself. Under the plenary power doctrine, Congress held the power to exclude. Public officials under the executive branch also held the power to enforce and implement these exclusions, and the judiciary should defer to the decisions of Congress and public officials.
Okay, so the Supreme Court upholds the Alien Immigration Act, and it basically says, where immigration is concerned, Congress and the executive branch get to make all the decisions. They don't even need to really explain themselves. And this becomes the playbook. As time passes and new supposed threats emerge, the government then uses its expansive immigration powers to target new groups and new ideas. By the 1940s and 50s, the threat of the day was communism.
Communism is a lying, dirty, shrewd, godless, murderous, determined, as J. Edgar Hoover says, a criminal conspiracy.
As anti-communist hysteria gripped the country throughout the 1950s, Congress only became more determined to root out alleged communists. Enter the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952.
And it's passed by Congress during the height of McCarthyism, and it becomes the most comprehensive and exclusionary law ever enacted and includes provisions that explicitly exclude communists or those affiliated with organizations that advocated, wrote, published, distributed, and taught world communism.
The president at the time, Harry Truman, was vehemently against the McCarran-Walter Act and called its ideological exclusion provisions, quote, thought control, and, quote, inconsistent with our democratic ideals. When the bill hit his desk, he actually vetoed it. In his veto statement, he forcefully wrote, quote, seldom has a bill exhibited the distrust evidence here for citizens and aliens alike. But Congress voted to override his veto and enact the law anyway. The act was used to turn away many prominent political and cultural figures, including the novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the poet Pablo Neruda, and the playwright Dario Fo. In fact, this law was practically an annual source of scandal. Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes was denied entry in 1962 and banned from the US for 30 years due to his suspected communist ties.
I asked once, do you ever get out of that list? Can I ever get out? He said, no. I said, even hell has its limits. Even in hell, you're promised that one day everybody will go to purgatory or to heaven. Hell is not forever. Surely the denial of a visa is not forever.
Unsurprisingly, the McCarran-Walter Act was eventually put to the test a few decades later.
So in 1969, a Belgian Marxist economist and journalist named Ernest Mandel is invited to a number of American universities and colleges to speak on their campuses, including Amherst, Princeton, Columbia, MIT, and Stanford.
When Mandel applied for a visa, his application was denied. That was especially strange, considering this wasn't his first visit to the United States.
According to correspondence with the U.S. consular official in Belgium, unbeknownst to Mandel, he is technically excluded under a section of the McCarran-Walter Act, barring those who advocate, write, or publish doctrines of world communism. But in his previous trips, he had been issued a waiver of inadmissibility, and that's how he was able to enter the United States.
Waivers needed to go through the Secretary of State and the Attorney General.
The State Department said that it had not recommended the waiver because it claimed Mandel had violated the restrictions on the conditional visa he received in 1968.
Apparently, on one of Mandel's earlier visits, he had strayed from his stated itinerary. That year, 1968, was the year of a 7-week-long mass uprising in France called the Student Protests. Mandel was visiting New York at the time, and during that visit, he went to a cocktail party. A party where the hosts happened to be raising money for the legal defense of those demonstrators in France. Going to that party, the government said, violated the terms of Mandel's visa.
Mandel insisted that he was not involved in the fundraising and had no idea that he had been traveling under a conditional restricted visa.
He even told the government, more or less, that he'd behave next time. The State Department was convinced, but remember, he also needed the Attorney General.
But Attorney General John N. Mitchell refuses to grant it. And this results in a public rift between the State and Justice Departments, where Secretary of State William P. Rogers, while discussing the Mandel case, asks, why should we be afraid of this man and his ideas?
Why indeed? Julia actually tried to find out the answer.
The Justice Department also says, in documents I found through Freedom of Information Act, that it doesn't want to import any more trouble than it has, citing Mandel's exclusion from France and support of the May protests, but really doesn't want to import any more trouble or speakers to talk on college campuses.
Ah, so there it is. It's all about the government's fear that Mandel's ideas from abroad would stir up trouble at home.
The Nixon administration was using ideological exclusion as a tool of political repression. And there is an outcry. There's an outcry from academics, students, public, members of the press, and they reiterate arguments made in the 1950s that this is a form of censorship, it's damaging to the United States, it's making the United States look fearful, it's a threat to academic freedom, it undermines American values and principles, and it makes the nation seem fearful of ideas and a lack of confidence in their own.
But challenging his exclusion was no easy feat for Mandel. John Turner's case at the start of the century established the precedent that foreign visitors seeking admission to the country lack the ability to vindicate their own First Amendment rights in court. Mandel could not sue on his own behalf. So his lawyers got creative.
What they do is they use the recent legal precedent establishing the right to hear, as well as the right to receive information, and has the American professors inviting Mandel to college campuses challenge the exclusion as a violation of their First Amendment right to receive information and to hear. So this is revolutionary.
Mandel's argument was not that the First Amendment protected his own right to speak, but that it protected the professor's right to hear from foreign visitors. The argument was clever and inventive, and it ended up working. Sort of.
Okay, so we have a decision by Justice Harry Blackmun, and the good news is that those within the United States can claim that they are harmed by the exclusion. All right, so this is a pathway to challenge exclusion. They've hit it. They've figured it out. Here's the bad news. The professors lose, and Mandela is excluded.
Once again, the court calls upon the plenary power doctrine and defers to the government because the court considers Mandela's case to be an immigration issue, not a free speech issue. But Justice Blackmun did poke a tiny hole in the plenary power doctrine.
They can't just exclude without a reason. So the government is required to issue a facially legitimate and bona fide reason for the exclusion. And he finds that cocktail party stray from the itinerary is facially legitimate and a bona fide reason.
So Mandela loses, but he doesn't go down without sounding off.
He thanks all of his lawyers and all who advocated on his behalf. And then he says, no revolutionary change was ever prevented by trying to suppress free circulation of ideas. If anything, such measures of suppression always, in the end, hasten radical social change rather than stopping it, end quote.
Peace on earth. That implies no violence, no fear.
Another decade later, another immigrant, a certain Beatle, would find himself in something of a similar position. John Lennon, rock star, artist, dreamer, was admitted to the US in 1970 under a waiver of inadmissibility. A few years earlier, he had been convicted in England of possessing cannabis, which meant that he was excluded from the US under the McCarran-Walter Act, unless he was granted a waiver. Unlike with Mandela, the government says, yes, Lennon can come. But his time in the US ended up raising some eyebrows.
He is an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War and the Nixon administration with his wife, Yoko Ono. He participates in rallies, TV interviews, the recording of Give Peace a Chance. And then in 1972, citing the drug conviction, the Justice Department refuses to renew Lennon's visa and orders him to leave the United States. And he says the real reason that I'm being ordered deported is because I'm a, quote, peacenik. All right.
Lennon said as much when he went on the Dick Cavett show that year to talk about the case.
They're after us because we talk about peace, you know. I mean, because we want peace, you know. We've said the same thing for 2 years, different way, one way or another, and we believe in it.
The only thing we promoted was peace and love.
And so Lennon hires a lawyer to challenge this deportation order. And that lawyer files a Freedom of Information Act to find out what the real motivations are about this strange deportation order. And this is a perfect example of a retaliatory or selective deportation.
Before 1972, Lennon had not been a priority for deportation. But that year, something changed. As President Nixon was running for re-election, Republican Senator Strom Thurmond sent a letter to the Justice Department, urging the Attorney General to move Lennon up the list.
Lennon is affiliated with the New Left groups and attracts young voters, and the voting age has actually been lowered now to 18, and there's concern about Lennon's popularity among the young, and that he is going to help the New Left, and this is going to thwart the re-election of Nixon. And so as a countermeasure, Strom Thurmond proposes, why don't you deport Lennon?
Nixon won re-election, but then Watergate happened, so he got busy with other things. Meanwhile, Lennon was still challenging his deportation order in court after Nixon resigned in 1974. And a year later, an appeals court found that Lennon's drug conviction didn't technically justify his exclusion.
Furthermore, it acknowledges that this is selective deportation, acknowledges the motivations when Lennon's lawyer produces all of this evidence. And the Second Circuit Court of Appeals says, will not condone selective deportation based on secret political grounds. And it's clear that the Nixon administration was trying to silence political opposition, which would be squarely protected under the First Amendment.
Lennon was able to get his green card another year later in 1976.
And this was what it was all about. Finally, after 4.5 long years of struggle, John Lennon got his card, a green card, saying that he's now a permanent resident of the United States.
Right on, brother.
The stories we've discussed so far span decades, and they involve everyone from anarchists to communists to peaceniks. The thread that ties all these people together? They wanted to share ideas that the government at the time viewed as dangerous or subversive. Not even the world-famous John Lennon was safe. These tools of ideological exclusion have unfortunately not been relegated to the dustbin of history. In fact, they've found renewed significance in the years following the attacks on September 11th, 2001.
Today we take an essential step in defeating terrorism. With my signature, this law will give intelligence and law enforcement officials important new tools to fight a present danger.
Just 6 weeks after the attacks, Congress passed the infamous USA Patriot Act. The so-called War on Terror that followed fundamentally altered American life, for citizens and non-citizens alike. It ushered in an era where the government freely traded off our most basic civil liberties for the fantasy of increased security. It was during this time that the Department of Homeland Security was established, along with one of its most important and powerful component agencies, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE.
The new department will analyze threats, will guard our borders and airports. The Department of Homeland Security will focus the full resources of the American government on the safety of the American people.
The newfound focus on perceived terrorist threats naturally led to a reinvigoration of the government's practice of ideological exclusion. During the Bush administration, the State Department routinely denied visas to foreigners whose political views it disfavored. This time, the primary targets of exclusion were Arab and Muslim intellectuals and scholars, especially those who criticized American foreign policy. This included Adam Habib, a South African scholar and expert on democracy, race, and social movements. Habib had frequently traveled to the US and had even earned his PhD from the City University of New York. He also happened to be a vocal critic of US foreign policy. In 2006, he was invited to come to the US to meet with members of a number of prominent institutions, including the NIH, the CDC, the World Bank, and Columbia University. But when he arrived at JFK Airport in New York, the State Department revoked his visa and refused to let him into the country. He was led back to an aircraft by armed guards and deported.
Well, the question is, between the last time I'd come in 2004 and 2006, what had changed? And the only thing that I can imagine was the Iraq War. There were demonstrations in South Africa. I was opposed to the war. I addressed those demonstrations. I did say very clearly that I thought it was a wrong thing.
The State Department even extended the exclusion to Habib's wife and 2 kids. It later told Habib that he was being barred from the country because he was, quote, engaged in terrorist activities. But the government never explained the basis for that accusation. The ACLU almost immediately challenged Habib's visa denial on First Amendment grounds. But it wasn't until 2010, 4 years later, that Habib was finally able to enter the country again. He was just one of dozens of scholars, artists, and activists who were barred from the US during the Bush administration. Years later, when Donald Trump became president in 2017, he did not need to rely on any new laws to begin excluding people from the country. All of that groundwork was more or less already there.
Nobody has any idea where these people are coming from, and we know they come from prisons. We know they come from mental institutions, insane asylums. We know they're terrorists. It's poisoning the blood of our country.
With his hands on the levers of power, Trump oversaw a dramatic expansion of exclusionary immigration policies, just like he promised on the campaign trail. His infamous Muslim ban, which targeted travelers from Muslim-majority countries, was carried out using powers invested in the president under the McCarran-Walter Act.
The immigration laws of the United States give the president powers to suspend entry into the country of any class of persons. Now, any class, it really is determined and to be determined by the president. for the interests of the United States, and it's as he or she deems appropriate.
Soon after, almost immediately, the travel ban is implemented and there's chaos.
Historian and lawyer Julia Rose Kraut.
So there's chaos in the airports. There's a question about how it's going to be implemented. What about people in the air? Are they going to now be banned if you have the valid visas? There's a rush. There's a rush of lawyers to the airports. There's a rush of protesters protesting this ban to the airports. There's a rush to the courthouses to try to get injunctions. I remember this well. And there's terrible uncertainty about what's going to happen. And terrible uncertainty from those within the United States about their loved ones, those outside of the United States, those who want to leave, will they be barred trying to come back? And separation of families, too, in terms of this ban.
The travel ban was almost immediately challenged in court, and it went to the Supreme Court in a case called Trump v. Hawaii. The court split 5-4 along ideological lines and upheld the ban. And what the court basically said is that it needed to step aside because this was an immigration matter.
What you have is the application of the plenary power doctrine once again. The courts are going to defer to the judgment of President Trump.
Whether the ban was ideologically motivated didn't factor into the court's decision at all, even though the president's intentions weren't exactly a mystery to anyone paying attention. Instead, the court reaffirmed the president's sweeping authority to shape immigration policy in exclusionary ways. For the rest of his term, Trump used those powers to create a culture of intimidation and fear among those he targeted. Ravi Ragbir certainly took notice.
This is like the Katrina that is going to overtake any wall that is going to be built, because this seed that is love is going to make that change. But there are hundreds of people going in there at the moment. We need to protect them. We need to protect each other.
This is Ravi speaking to a crowd outside of ICE headquarters in Lower Manhattan in 2017, right before walking into an appointment with ICE officers. As always, he didn't come alone. By this point, he had been under a stay of removal for 6 years, and his check-ins with ICE had diminished from a few times a week to a few times a year.
Can you tell me about what happened during your scheduled check-in with ICE on March 9th, 2017? Did it feel different from your prior check-ins?
Of course it did. This was the first check-in after the administration had changed. So, of course, it was different. We knew that. This was the time when people were told by the deportation officers, hey, you need to come with a passport and a ticket. We're going to deport you tomorrow or whatever, right? And people were walking in with passport and tickets. So we knew this wasn't going to be an easy check-in.
Hundreds of people crowded Federal Plaza, the imposing Lower Manhattan building that houses the Federal Immigration Court. Ravi brought many people inside with him, including a handful of elected officials. He thinks that made a difference. ICE declined to deport Ravi that day, but told him to come prepared with a passport and a ticket next time. As the year wore on, Ravi knew people who weren't so lucky, who did get detained and deported. According to agency data, ICE arrests shot up 30% that year. Newly emboldened agents surprised people at work, at court, in places that had previously been considered off limits for immigration arrests. Ravi feels certain that agents were looking for opportunities to do the same to him.
My lawyers, my friends, my community, they started working with me when I went from the office to my home and back. And that night when we knew they were looking for us, people went out on the streets and saw ICE vehicles around the office and around my home. So my friend, he went to see what was happening at my home. And when he took out the keys, he heard the walkie-talkie squawking. He heard a lot of that, right? So he knew that there were vehicles there. And when I was at the office, my attorney, she's a awesome person, right? She was pregnant, 9 months pregnant. And she went on the street looking and asking, are you my Uber, to see who it was. And when you look down, you will see the ICE license plate on the floor. Oh yeah, we know your ICE.
Despite living in this climate of fear, Ravi continued to show up for his ICE appointments, with his crowds of friends, family, clergy, and fellow activists in tow. After that March check-in, he remembers someone asking him, why?
I said, if I am not willing to take that risk with all the support and all the things that we have done, right? If I'm afraid to do that, how can other people be willing to stand up? Right? You have to set the standard. You have to be walking out there. Yeah, I could get deported, but I know that I have done what I needed to do, and if someone else gets inspiration from that, that could trickle down and affect others and be able to help others stand up also. So I went in there fully aware that what could have happened, which it did happen.
January 10th, 2018. Ravi was directed to a room on the 10th floor of the ICE building. Only his wife and his attorney were allowed to go in with him. No one would answer any questions.
The assistant director came in and he said, this is it. You're going. You're going.
Everything moved really quickly after that. Ravi passed out. ICE agents called an ambulance that had to push through a crowd of demonstrators to make it away from Federal Plaza. Arriving at the hospital, agents told Amy, Ravi's wife, to get out, and then sped away. Ravi was in detention in Florida by that night. He could have been back in Trinidad the next day, but for the help of his lawyer. A week later, Amy published an op-ed about the whole experience in the New York Times. An immigration attorney herself, she wrote, quote, "I know how deportation tears at the fabric of families and communities. But now I am inside this nightmare personally, and it hurts more than I ever thought it would." The op-ed caught the eye of a lawyer who helped Ravi sue ICE.
And he said, this is a First Amendment issue. And he reached out to them. I was in detention already, right? And he reached out to them and he said, do you want me to take this case? And obviously we said, yeah, take it, right?
Ravi and his legal team alleged that the agency's attempt to deport him was part of a broader pattern of retaliation against immigrants who freely exercised their right to free speech. His case went up before the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit.
And the appeal court said, yes, you have a right. There's a definite retaliation here, and you have a First Amendment protection right.
As the litigation progressed, Ravi learned why exactly ICE had been so hell-bent on targeting him.
In their documents that they submitted to the court, they said they didn't like how I described them as Nazis and all of these things, right? They wrote that I was very loud, and they were very annoyed with me, and that
sure.
A lot of what came out in the court papers is that they were surveilling me regularly. So the director even talked about the fact that he knew where I lived, he knew where I walked to get to the train to go to my route to go to the office. He even said I bebopped. I have no idea what bebop means, right? But I bebopped. I wear a fedora. He knew the fedora. He was given details that was shocking to everyone.
These admissions made it all the more obvious that it was Ravi's speech and activism that painted a target on his back for deportation. The Second Circuit agreed. It called ICE's conduct outrageous and explained that, quote, "To allow this retaliatory conduct to proceed would broadly chill protected speech among not only activists subject to final orders of deportation, but also those citizens and other residents who would fear retaliation against others." We at the Knight Institute filed an amicus brief in support of Ravi to make clear that the government cannot wield the threat of deportation as a tool to suppress the speech of non-citizens. Forcing immigrants to choose between expressing their opinions or remaining in the country violates the most basic guarantees of the First Amendment. Eventually, the government offered Ravi a settlement, which included a 3-year deferred action. In 2022, he chose to accept.
The end of that 3 years is this year, 2024. So after 2024, I'll be back in the position as of 2018, and therefore they can take me away when my next check-in, which is in January 2025.
What happens after that?
What happens after that? They could use that final order to shackle me and deport me, right? At any time after the deferred action. So what happens afterwards is that every day I would be living like how I used to live when I got released from detention, not knowing what tomorrow will bring. It's not something you should be living through. And this is just not just about me, George. This is not about only what I am living and what Ravi. No, this is about every single immigrant. This is about every single immigrant who is under the threat of deportation, who lives under that. We have thousands of people, we have millions of people.
That's why after everything, Ravi believes his case against the government was worth it.
When you looked at what was our objective in this lawsuit, obviously to call out the retaliation. And, it was good that we call out retaliation because this is what fascism is about, right? Retaliating against people who speak out. If it's in the court and it's public documents, it can be used by everyone.
Thanks to Ravi's lawsuit, people now know the truth about ICE's attempts to silence activists with the threat of deportation. What happened to him shows us what follows when we allow the government to use its immigration powers to target people for expressing so-called dangerous ideas. Historian Julia Rose Kraut doesn't mince words.
Ideological exclusion is a form of censorship, and it violates the First Amendment, and it can lead to a chilling effect on free speech and association, causing individuals to suppress their beliefs and expressions, and to preclude their associations due to fear and intimidation. And their expressions and beliefs are not actual national security threats.
Our country's long and troubled history with ideological exclusion illustrates the vast and largely unchecked power the government wields in immigration enforcement, even when its authority raises serious free speech concerns. It is one of the reasons the border is often viewed as a gray area, even an exception when it comes to fundamental constitutional protections. These practices only become more concerning when new technology comes into play. In a world mediated by electronic devices, social media, and algorithms, the very concept of the border itself is being reshaped as we speak. That has enabled the government to employ new and even more expansive forms of censorship and surveillance, designed to silence viewpoints and suppress dissent.
There's a warning sign that we received in 2019 about this. And this is Ismail Ajawi, a Palestinian student from Lebanon, arriving at Boston Logan International Airport in late 2019 on his way to begin his freshman year of college at Harvard University. And he carried a valid visa with him. And Ajawi was detained and questioned for a number of hours by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and his phone was searched. And subsequently, his visa was revoked, and he was deemed inadmissible due to political views opposing the United States or critical of the United States, not posted by him, but posted on one of his friends' lists. And this is a perfect example of guilt by association through the use of social media.
Needless to say, the framers didn't have smartphones or social media in mind when they drafted the First Amendment. And as technology continues to develop, sometimes our rights get left behind. The government has taken advantage of this gap between our constitutional protections and new technologies to collect data on and engage in censorship of citizens and non-citizens alike. But new threats also mean new opportunities for resistance. We at the Knight Institute are dedicated to defending the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age. Over the next few episodes, we'll explore the changing role of the border as a location, justification, and pretext for government surveillance and censorship, and how we are fighting back. On the next episode of Speech and the Border, social media. Love it or hate it, so much of what we do nowadays is online. But visa applicants know better than most that nothing they do online is truly private. Immigration authorities have been collecting their social media handles since 2019 as part of extreme vetting policies that are still in effect.
Once you give the social media handle to the government, it's not just going to keep it, right? It's going to use it in order to find out stuff about you.
The dangers of government social media surveillance. I am George Wang. I'm a lawyer at the Knight First Amendment Institute. Thank you for listening to this episode. Speech in the Border is co-produced by Anne-Marie Awad and Kushal Dev. Our executive producer is Candace White. Our engineer is Patrice Mondragon. Creative direction from Carrie DeSalle. Fact-checking by Roni Gal-Az and Teddy Weich. The art for our show was designed by Nash Weir-Sekara. Our theme music was composed by Grayton Newman with additional music from Epidemic Sound. Views on First is available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe and leave a review. We'd love to know what you think. To learn more about the Knight Institute, visit our website, knightcolumbia.org. That's Knight with a K. And follow us on social media. Special thanks to Hangar Studios. Bye now.